Hello, I'm going to talk to you about the science of spaced repetition and how you can apply it to your teaching and your learning. None of this is new science. In fact, some of it is very old science, but it has been curiously underutilized in education, including medical education. What I'm going to talk about applies equally well to the teachers as the learners. And it not only applies to cognitive skills, but also many physical skills. Let's talk a little about medical education. A lot of medical education is done by the students reading the same material again and again, so-called repeated review, or attending lectures on the same material again and again. Unfortunately, repeated reading does not equal long-term memorization. We recognize the text on the page, but this does not mean that we can recall it out of context, understand it, or necessarily apply it. For this, we need much deeper learning mechanisms that we will discuss. This is called the illusion of mastery. We know the text, so we think we understand it. Cramming is a type of repeated review, and it's a very effective way of getting stuff into short-term memory, but unfortunately it doesn't last into long-term memory. And if you think the repeated review is efficient, then look at this image and tell me which head of the penny is correct. The answer is B. Now, you've looked at pennies a lot of times, and I'm betting a significant proportion of you got that wrong. So how soon do we forget? Well, this is a German psychologist called Hermann Ebbinghaus, who performed a whole load of experiments towards the end of the 19th century. And in a series of these experiments, he had himself learn a large number of random syllables like this. So they weren't real words, they're just random syllables. And then he would test to see how quickly he forgot them. And this is the curve that he produced after this series of experiments. And it's pretty scary and has been reproduced by many, many different types of learning over the last 100 or so years. And what he showed here is by 1 hour, you could only remember 44% of what you're taught. By 1 day, we're down to only a third of what you taught, which is kind of a depressing fact for those of us who spend a lot of time teaching or those of us who spend a lot of time learning. And in fact, he came up with an equation for this. And what he said was the amount of memory that's retained is inversely proportional to the time since learning it, as shown by that curve, and proportional to the strength of the memory. Now, we can't do a whole lot about the time, so we've got to look on how we can improve the strength of the memory. In other words, how can we interrupt the forgetting? So here's a typical Ebbinghaus curve if we've learned the material once and we've not reviewed it at all. But what happens if after a day we go back and we revisit the information, we test ourselves and make ourselves recall it? And then you can see that the slope is much more gradual. And how about 7 days later? We're going to make ourselves recall the information again. We're going to test ourselves in the information, not just review it again. We're actually going to test ourselves. Well, this time after we've recalled the information, the slope is more shallow again. And so on until we've nearly retained 100% of the information. And this is what's called spaced interval testing. Now, has anyone done this in medical education? Now, has anyone actually tested this? Well, yes, they have. And this is one such study which was done by Kerfoot, who is a urologist at Harvard. And he took two groups of urology residents, and they were learning about and being tested about urohistopathology. One group learned the information from spaced education. It was actually a flip-over design study. And one just by conventional web-based modules. And what you can see is while the spaced education group took longer to learn the information, and maybe they didn't learn quite so much, they retained that information much better than the group that just did web-based modules that pretty much forgot everything. And what's happening here can be demonstrated like this. The first time that you learn something, the path to that memory in the forest of your mind is really very faint. You can barely see it. But each time you travel down that path, it gets more distinct and more distinct until it's very easy to go down that path and retrieve that memory. One thing that's interesting is you have to challenge your brain in some way to be able to make this work well. These are called desirable difficulties. So you need to make it not too easy to retrieve the information. And one way is by leaving a period of time between when you learn the information and when you test yourself. So don't read it, test yourself At the same time, you should leave it a day or 2 days before you test yourself. There are also many studies that allowing yourself to sleep between learning the information and trying to recall it can be very helpful. The brain does a lot of important consolidation of memories during sleep. Each time we recall information, and particularly if we recall it in different ways, so we're not using the same testing method each time, so maybe we use multiple choice sometime, but maybe we do fill in the blank another time, for example, we add connections to the memory and we restore it after recalling it. And this makes it much more easily available to the brain to recall under different situations. And what you're doing here is you're not only giving your brain one route to the memory, but you're making additional pathways so that your brain can retrieve this memory from all sorts of different places, a much stronger and more robust learning method. Luckily, there are a bunch of different softwares out there that can help learners do spaced interval testing. I've just mentioned a few of the ones here. My medical student daughter is a great fan of Quizlet. A bunch of these use what's called Lightner Box Methodology. And in this concept, you have 3 pools of questions. Question pool 1, you review the most frequently. Question view 2, middle frequency. And then question box 3, not so often. When you get a question right, it's going to move up through the boxes and be reviewed less often. If you get the question wrong, then it's going to move down through the boxes and it will be reviewed more often until you get it right. How could we use spaced interval testing in our teaching? Well, day 1, you could teach subject 1, give the learners a quick post-test at the end of it, and the next day email them out some questions and answers. So put the answers in a separate email and the questions, so they have to mentally test themselves before they look at the answers. It is important they have the answers though. You could repeat it with a different set of questions on day 7, and then when you come a month later to do another lecture in your lecture series, put a quick test at the beginning of the lecture on subject 1 before you move on to teaching subject 2. That's all I have to say. There's lots of really interesting stuff out there on spaced interval testing if you want to investigate it further.